So welcome, thank you so much for coming out this exceedingly warm evening for our wonderful reading this evening. We were in luck, I think it will be a fantastic one. My name is Catherine Coles, I'm the director of Trias, and I am the introducer of the actual reader this evening. I wanted to remind you to turn off your cell phones. That only applies to the old people in the room like me who still actually keep their cell phones not on vibe. I find that in my classroom, the only time the phone ever goes off is when it's my phone, which is totally embarrassing. But for all of the old people in the room like me, turn off your cell phones. The rest of you keep them exactly as they are. But don't look at them, please, during the okay. I would like to thank Peter Trias, first and foremost, always our patron saint of creative writing here at Hobart and Colleges, who allowed this wonderful reading series to happen and our program with a writing in residence to take place. This wonderful thing that we've got going on at HWS. And to the provost's office, to the English department, and we have co-sponsorships from this semester from Asian Studies and from Art and Architecture as well. Lots of people contributing to the wonderful reading series. Next semester we have 2 readings on the roster. And I don't have dates for you tonight, but I know that Jess Rowe, the wonderful fiction writer Jess Rowe, will be coming mid-February. And then Jen Bourbon, the poet and hybrid forms artist, is going to be coming mid-March. So we'll send out emails about those. They'll both be completely fantastic readings that we're really excited about. I think that is everything for this evening. So Mary Ruefle, our Trias writer, and myself.
Who has not let his thoughts wander? Are not your own wandering at this very moment? Poetry, since its very beginnings, has offered to its audience the innermost thoughts of men and women whose hearts happen to be beating. That is the living. We have only to read the poetry of the distant past, that is, the dead, to see this. And once we do, we are inevitably struck by the similarity those thoughts bear to our own. This is true. Yet one of the marks of the 20th century was to bring to literature the actual stream of consciousness as it struggled to even find a thought it could hold and call its own. The poems of Michael Burkard, which first began to appear in the 1970s, and influenced a group of poets coming of age at that time, are a case study of this principle. The very journey each of us makes as we think ourselves through each day, though very few of us ever stop to think about our thinking. Burkhart's poems stop to think about thinking. Many of the poems are predicated on a confusion he patiently seeks to unravel, only to find a new knot has formed, until the case appears hopeless. But just at the point of hopelessness, there is a loophole, and through this loophole comes streaming the tenderness, which is our only solace. Compassion toward the very predicament of being alive and having this river inside us. The results can be hilarious, or they can be heartbreaking. And as such, reading the poems can be like entering an enchanted forest, or like being stuck in a very interesting traffic jam. The poems may be instigated by dreams, memories, a single word or phrase or idiom, a conversation, remark, passing encounter, or deeply felt intimacy. But in all cases, a driving befuddlement is weathered through to that tenderness, the only humane response to life that is possible. As mapped by his wandering mind and all the verbal slippage therein, the world is remade as an instance of both mystery and mercy. As Gerard de Nerval said, speaking of modern art over a century ago, it is the overflowing of dream into reality. And this poet overflows, modernism spilling into postmodernism, in ways that celebrate the wind that blows through every mind at every minute, reminding us that language is wind, made of breath, spirit, and the moving mouth. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the very real and tender Mr. Burkard.
Thank you very much. This really feels wonderful for me to be back at my alma mater. And I also had the good fortune of, I was acquainted with Peter Trias, and from Iowa City days. And, what I still recall is that he was very good friends with two students who had been at William Smith's, and then became a good friend of a wonderful poet who just recently passed away last year, Thomas Solomon. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you. I was going to begin with two very, very old poems. My junior year here was 1966. And I used to go to the library intending to study and really wouldn't do very well with that. And I would wind up, for some reason, even though I wasn't a photographer, I loved looking at the best of any given year. U.S. Camera magazine would put in, they'd have these yearly anthologies, and I was forever looking through the poetry, through the photographs. And one night, I'd been in the library about 5 minutes and took some U.S. Camera anthologies, and I think I was reading selected poems by Ezra Pound, and it was the first time where I ever experienced something writing itself. I wasn't planning to write. I read one line of Pound's, and the line was Bah, B-A-H, Bah, I have sung of women in 3 cities. And at that moment, something happened, and something was writing through me, and something I'd never experienced. And but I'd like to read 2 of them because I think they still survive well after all these years, and I felt gifted. It's something I'm not taking full credit for at all. 2 untitled poems. You underline your sentences with jewels and rope in old railroad ties. I am supposed to call you unique. You want me to remember you. You raise balloons in the winters in Leningrad and carry them in the streets on fur strings. I buy you silk stockings in different sizes because your legs keep changing. I notice you while the great black sky harbors stones that can drop any time. And this other one, again untitled, Your perfume makes me shiver. We counted 7 dead whales on the beach. They will never see the face of God. They are diseased. When all the water in those dead mammals stops struggling, you will paint them in colors that were not theirs. Directing reflections the way a still sea would. And all those visitors you have will become acquainted with the spouts and tails of the dead and think that the sea is not such a vast room. What was delightful for me, I didn't do it with any, it with any real intention, but I was on the Hobart Review staff, and after writing these, I immediately left the library thinking, what the hell has happened? And went and told my roommate, Mark Raven, and he read the poems and liked them, and then I didn't want to influence the other three readers on the Hobart Review staff, Bob Funt and Fitch Cady and someone else. And so I created a pseudonym, and they liked the poems. We printed 4 of them in the review, but I kept my mouth shut about the pseudonym. But people really loved the poems. One time I was in the English department waiting to see somebody, and Mel Hill and Roger Farron were talking about, who is this guy, Jim Starr? Nobody knows who he is. And his poems, it was really, I had a good time with it, in a really private way, which was really touching. But that experience of something writing itself didn't occur to me again. It didn't happen to me again for about 3.5 more years. This is a poem from a few years ago that has seen some revision. It's called The Killers, based on which I refer to immediately, Ernest Hemingway's story, The Killers, and involves Lee Harvey Oswald, who was actually, before he left Russia, was actually at times tutoring English to Russian students. The Killers. Lee Harvey Oswald could be heard reading Hemingway's The Killers in English to some Russian students, an old wire recording which had haphazardly survived and needed no decoding. It was better than having a famous actor read the story. It was actually kind of chilling, not fun, spooky like the word eventually feels, like the wind sounds sometimes. Tonight, when I meant to leave the office early, but have lingered like the snow and the streets light falling on the snow. My parents bought, a very white jacket when I was in the 3rd grade. It seemed extremely special and one of a kind. It wasn't corduroy, it had ridges in it almost like that. But even by the 3rd grade, I must not have been making another kind of grade, because I could not bring myself to wear it to school or even around the neighborhood. It was so special I thought I would receive some kind of unwarranted attention, unwanted attention. The jacket would be ruined, not literally, but in some figurative fashion. But who is kidding whom? I was afraid the jacket would be torn and smeared by someone or someone's, and I would be smeared or smashed for wearing it. It's a poem entitled Later 13. One witness denies that the nuclear waste was dumped in a liquid form directly into the canyon. One witness is distracted by his id. My parents have entered the slow burn, telling a story about what a visit to England in the truest way possible can do to you, or not do, or midday, or not midday. A single, not even petal, did not go down the drain during recess, so the white of it, very small, is drying or dying on a green sheet of paper. One witness says, I do not recall the shape of the canyon, but I recall the shape of the liquid form from a dream. I had, and I can tell you this is a kind of double emptiness, a drink you could order. I'll have a double, no, make that a double emptiness. It's hot, so I'm dragging as many people to AA meetings as I can, she says. And then I see this liquid dream, and I know I have been breathing these toxins, and so have my children, and all these trees and woods for at least 10 years. is entitled Nerve, and it references a poem by poet John Berryman from a book of his entitled Delusions, etc. And when I referenced the poem he wrote, the title I'm using is incorrect. The actual title of Berryman's poem is Drug, Alcohol, Little Sister. And my memory, when I wrote this a few years ago, told me it's referring to a German poet named Georg Trakl. And I thought Trakl was the name of the poem until I re-looked it up. And what I quote as the last phrase is the last three words of the poem that I'm saying I'm reading from in the poem. They are in the last couple of lines of Berryman's poem, but they don't actually close it. But I decided that I'd leave the quote-unquote mistake in. So, Nerve. Why did I buy the house I'm in, where I hardly ever live? It is as if it is an expensive studio for, say, drawings, and perhaps could become an expensive studio to paint in, if I can ever work up the nerve to paint. I say nerve because I'm afraid that I will either be a real lousy painter or afraid once I start painting, there will be no turning back. One possibility does not necessarily negate the other. That is, I could become a non-stop lousy painter and delude myself. Delusions, etc. is a book by Berryman I enjoyed at the time, but can no longer find my copy of it. One poem I think was called Trakl, after the German poet, and the last line read, overdose and go. This is a poem I haven't typed up yet. It's only about 7 years old. This is actually an experience I had without hyperbole. Just one of these curious things that we call coincidences or serendipitous, and it really struck me, and was very, in that sense, was very easy to write, just because I was reporting on what had transpired that very day. And I simply used the first phrase for the title, was going to sing. Was going to sing Peace in the Valley at my father's memorial service, but I didn't. I spoke instead, not wanting to surprise anyone by singing, not wanting to draw some attention to myself. And then, after a meal with relatives, I drive the 1 hour back to Syracuse and decide to stop in a bookstore before going home. And I am very happy to see a new book of poems by Alice Notley entitled In the Pines. And I take it from the shelf and open it to page 88, simply to browse. And the first stanza paragraph I see begins its sentence with, my brother sang Peace in the Valley at my cousin's funeral. These poems I'll read next are from a book that Sarah Van Books did entitled Unsleeping. A a small ring. Almost all rings are small, but this one had under its cheap convex imitation glass a tree and another small tree beside it, staggering trees in a small picture, in a small ring, in a small story, in a small, not even town. In a time when you yourself were much smaller than you felt, about to enter more phases of life answers, unawares, blind to what you're doing, really. People you are about to hurt, ghost of yourself you are to hurt again, and you are also missing lives, of course, that could you have helped, possibly, in small ways. Lives which needed help. People playing people like objects. What's the use? Almost all people are small when it comes to claim time. This poem references my mother's sister, Nellie, my aunt, who spent her life in Nova Scotia, and also references one of the Albany trains that runs frequently to New York City from Albany. The train name is the Hudson, because obviously it takes the Hudson River out the west window as its route. It's called Train's Name. Then there is my literal biological brother who moved away. Take the Hudson and you can get there. Permission is another thing. My aunts were some of his favorite people. Mine too, but they are gone, now glinting like this last fall light on the river west of my small window. Who has closed Nellie's eyes? Who, lastly, drinks from the river? I have a poem in this book, Lucky Code Anywhere, that's really too long to read, but I'm going to just read a couple of pages of it. It kind of is, I think it's a kind of poem that, honestly, the lack of associations between the small sections, I think one could read it in a very arbitrary way, going from something on page 2 of the poem to page 4. It would make as much sense as it's making now. But I lived in Brooklyn for a while in the 1980s, and I always wanted to use this musical title as a title for a poem. It's called Take the A Train. And it simply begins. They're very short sections. Take the A train. Once, long, long, long ago, in the someone else sun, I still have some cards, some family notes. Everything is for K. K who is R. If R is K, who is T? Leaves to figure and make at eye level, to Christ, to subway, to work, to heart. I can flounder like a star said the third star on the horizon. But tonight I will not flounder at all. I will greet every busy person with wisdom, and straw I will greet as one hand. Cheyenne went west and then was disenfranchised by the little remaining family east she had. I have this creepy feeling I'm going to continually misspell something important or say it backwards. What I'm really trying to say is I fear I am too headed for an evening, be it a weekend night or not, when I will be so excited and so out of hand, I will be brought like Phyllis into a hospital or some facility from some whatever the hell in my life will be, the tiresome equivalent of an airport. I enjoy repetition, and I'm surprised in a way. It was quite simple, sheer repetition at times, and I'm surprised in a way when I look back that I didn't try to employ it as any kind of way of working, but for quite a long time, and then felt a real affection with it, as if it was creating a kind of support while I wrote that I could return to frequently or with variation, and would create a sense that you could get away with anything. No, I'm just kidding. But I did have fun with a number of the poems that I used simple repetition with in the beginning of or ending of a line. This is called Erotic Life Thoughts. And I believe everything in here is also a question. Any leads on the broken window? Any way now to know the answer to your life? Any weight? Any answer? Any fortune in store as cheap as the one you just read? Any semicolon the bird would eat from your hand? A fairy tale with a bridge leading to a penis? A gingerbread house where the leaves were stone green? Any solution to the mast of stone green poem? Any cool coin you could grab for again as a little boy? Any sexual identity which clarified again that you knew the forest began, but you could not get yourself to tell the snow or the thaw? A fairy tale with a bridge leading to a broken window? Any room for Tomas's right book on the table? A green stone which directed cheap fortunes back to the sun? An old house which is large and is the answer to the letter Z? Any trees which resulted in a conspiracy? Any eats? Any daylight word? I'll read just a few more. One is short, and I'll close with a slightly longer poem. This again, based on a humorous experience I had. A dear friend of mine, William Rosenfeld, gave him a wonderful hardbound copy I had bought in a used bookstore that was in great shape of Kafka's Complete Stories. It had this wonderful yellow and black book jacket. And after I gave it to Bill, when I'd be over at his house, I'd see it up on his living room shelf, which was ceiling about 10 feet, and a large bookshelf would be maybe 8 feet. I regretted terribly giving it. So, this is called How to Ask. Seeing the black-yellow cover leaf of the Kafka book I gave away, now forgotten, until again sitting in their house, in a certain chair, looking up in a certain way, to realize, I want this book. Among many I have given away, I want this book back. How to ask, how to sit listening to conversation among the three of us, when most of all, I want this Kafka back. I finally, I think when Bill saw the poem in the book, I think he gave it back. So, if you lose something in one return, that's the trick. That's the trick. I will read a very short poem from Lucky Code Anywhere, very close to the southern poem. Sun layers. My arms rise. This is partly because I'm standing in front of someone else. So close, their arms could look like mine from far away. And from as far away as the sea I am afraid of, I could take to the streets with these arms intact. If something deadly or wounded should happen to mine. And the poem I'm going to close with is entitled Anger. And there isn't, it might seem in the beginning because of, there's a brief repetition at the beginning of lines of the word when, but it doesn't stay in that notion. Anger. When you have produced a black flower which ends more than one sentence, when you sit between the wall and the broken face of your own life, when you have hardened because the moon made you feel lost and found and lost again. When you found your moon a week later in a pawn shop, but thought it was the shadow moon, and sold the thing for a hole in the night's snow, as if it was a dream. When you have filed charges against yourself, but no one sits at the appropriate desk to take the paperwork from you. When the black flower ends a sentence before you end it. I remember one day when my eyes touched the sky and the day. I was accused of being too elementary in the world and, quote unquote, furthermore, to what purpose is your calmness? The charges continued. The next day and the day after that, I was forced to read in interviews in which I said I loved myself. I was talking in the interview about myself by name, in third person, My voice was described by investigators as, quote unquote, pleased with itself like a gift. If you must know, they said, he didn't stop reading aloud until we told him to. My voice wanted to see you, darling, but you were nowhere to be found. I was glad for that. I would not have wanted you to be found. Still, I missed you like today, and I tried to hear you in the words between the words I had to read. Sometimes I pretended you were near me, and that you had written these words only for me, as a major joke I would eventually get. I got angry. I wanted you and the sea to be my lawyers, my representatives, my guardians at the very least. I still would not mention you by name, but the investigators sensed my neediness. They began offering me pawn tickets and pictures of a graveyard they said someone very, very close to me used to make love in. That this someone still thinks of that place. A black flower I thought was part of a harmless sentence I had written, one day was brought to the protruding, highly and vulnerable glass of water I could now drink. What looked like a modern printer under the clock on the wall began to make false starts. And what had looked like the moon to me and had been mine for years had become part of the interrogation and was no more the moon than a trailer moon as well as a trader moon, a counterfeit. I am a nevertheless, I said, and I am no longer reading what I have said. I will overtake myself with still another day of moonlight. I will see that no one else is involved, not copper, not a door, not any ill house being rained upon by the illness of a trader rain. I will see to it that my unnamed kisses will remain just who she or he is, unnamed. I will be, at last, the end of you. I will be your face me and your game of waiting or not showing up at all. I will be the end of me for you. I will leave nothing left for the world to take from me or for the world to violate. At the end of the silent evening, at the beginning of the next day, when the moon and the sun act as little stones at either side of the early morning womanly world. Thank you very much. Thank you. I wasn't trying to hurry up.
You're also a visual artist and you're write songs. So you make art in 3 different ways. I'm wondering what the relationship is between those modes, or when you choose to paint and when you choose to make a style.
I was very lucky. My brother could draw very well and paint very well. I couldn't. And my father could too. But when I was living in Provincetown, Massachusetts, there was a self-taught painter named Mary Hackett, who was at that point in her early 80s. I absolutely loved her work. And I got to meet her, and I'd go over to her house about every third day. And she loved company, and we'd have a slow cup of coffee. And she painted furniture and painted floors in her house creatively, and her work was up everywhere. And she had art books out, and we always talked about painting. And after I knew her a number of months, she said to me one day, she said, "Michael, you love painting so much, but you don't even draw. Why don't you draw?" And I said, "Mary, I can't draw." And she said, "Oh, for God's sakes, don't let that stop you." And honestly, the next morning, I bought crayons and some drawing pencils and started drawing. And immediately, I knew it. I still couldn't draw referentially, really accurately, but there was line and color, and it became this real delight in a very relaxing way, since it was never my profession. I remained an amateur, but what would happen inadvertently over time, I'd have a poem or something that wouldn't work out. It would wind up on the same table that I'd be drawing on or whatever. And it wasn't doodling, but it would eventually have some marks. And I had this little cubicle studio years later in Provincetown. And there were 5 of us in this studio space. And once in a great while, someone would drop by to see me. And I'd have something I was working on in front of me, hoping they'd comment on it, even if it was like not finished. And they never did, but they'd see this like thing with words on it, but marked, and they'd say, "When did you do that?" And I hadn't done anything. I mean, it just happened. And so I started not trying to be too conscious of it, taking poems that were half bad, and even making a drawing that might be half bad, but putting them together. And that became fun. The songwriting was a completely secret life since I was 11 years old. And I just was always writing songs in my head, but no one ever knew. And finally, a friend of mine, when I was 35, said, "Why don't you," I told him finally, and he said, "Why don't you buy a handheld tape recorder?" But those always, the ones that work, it's like I said about those first poems I read, they come together. It's not that I know musical notation, but out of the blue, I'll just get a melody in my head and words at the same time. They both could, even the ones that work, sometimes I know the lyrics could do well with a little reworking. But I don't know quite why it occurs, but it still occurs, and I really enjoy it. Although it only occurred to me a couple of years ago that 95% of what I do with that, it doesn't amount to much of anything. But I realized even in some of those, there were some good lines that I've been trying to think of ways of extracting and using in poems, which had just had not occurred to me for many, many years. Yeah. So, and I think music was probably more of a natural influence on me when I was even very little. My father played piano and organ and played every day. And I don't know why. I never told my dad. He lived to be 100 years old. And even as an adult, I don't know if I ever told him, like, "Gee, could you try this melody out on the piano or something?" And but I had a really good time with it. And I'm the first, you listen to your songs, I think it's easier even for me than with poems. I listen to them, and if it's not working, I'm the first one to turn it off and skip to the next thing. And it's very easy to tell, like, that's going nowhere as fast. And for some reason, when I walk into an empty men's room, I get inspired a lot. It's true. In fact, it was happening so much at Syracuse. I went to this men's room in another art building, and it happened to me again. And so I said to myself, the next day, I said, I'm going to go back there consciously, because by doing this consciously, it won't happen. It happened again. One time in my office building, it was in the summer, and I was in there by myself doing a song, and a gentleman came in with his son, and somebody was apologizing, and I said, "No, be the backup group, be the backup group." So.
Could you tell the anecdote about how you came around to fitness?
Oh yeah, I was in my I was in my early 40s, and I was driving near Albany, and Prairie Home Companion was on a Sunday afternoon, and they had a singer who was singing a composition of Emily Dickinson, 2 poems that were put to music. It was very lovely. It wasn't operatic. It was in her English, in her Americanese. And suddenly I felt like I got her. I know now what to look for. I never knew how to read Dickinson or really feel her in a visceral way. So a couple months after that, I was reading her. I was just laying on the couch at my house. And Elvis Presley had this great album that came out right after he got out of the Army. And there was this really great blues song called Reconsider Baby that a number of people had done. But he wasn't over-voiced by a vocal group, and you could tell they were all just really into it. And suddenly it occurred to me that Dickinson's poems could be sung exactly to this great blues title, Reconsider Baby. I'm not a very good voice right now, but because I could not stop for that, he kind of stopped for me. Because I could not stop for that, he kind of stopped for me. I don't even remember the next line of the poem. But it could be done. And then, when she would get quite abstract at times with different poems with diction, when I would do those, trying to sing that same basic melody, it sounded like she was talking about something down and dirty that you couldn't articulate directly or you'd be in a lot of trouble. I actually looked for a Dickinson poem in a little anthology tonight to bring along, but none of the few poems they had. I also, though, and it helped my songwriting a lot, I became belatedly a great, great fan only a decade or so ago of Langston Hughes' poetry and his fiction. And one day I said to myself, what if I tried putting some of these shorter poems to music, just using the words are already there. And sometimes they're quite rhyming and rhyming, and other times they're not. And I realized after about a year of trying this out with Hughes that it helped my songwriting immensely, just using his poetry. And it's amazing. It's been a really interesting experience. And I adore his work. I don't know, again, he was a writer that I read a little of, but and I even liked his fiction, the simple stories, and I really think the world of his work.
I guess this is sort of a big question. So, I love the way you read, and I'm wondering when you write, do you write in the kind of syncopation that you actually read?
No, that's an interesting question to me. I think I do a bit. Because I know, in the poems at least I read tonight, that even though these are pretty much first drafts, there will be pauses where I'm waiting or something is quiet for a moment and then heads on. And I'm sure that kind of timing affects sometimes syntax or how I'm putting something together. But yeah, I would like to think that, the way you put the question, I would like to think that so. Because even when it seems like something's being dictated to me from who knows where, which isn't an uncommon experience for people in all sorts of circumstances, let alone the arts, but there will still be at times like, I'd rather make sure I'm going, if anything, too slowly than too rapidly so that I won't miss something. And I remember the first time I saw an analogy about that, I believe, it was real curious to me after having that experience in the Hobart Williams Library. Jack Spicer, for those of you who don't know, was a poet and essayist and San Francisco poet. And Caterpillar magazine had this issue devoted solely to him. And he apparently took a notion of Cocteau's, that he thought of Spicer said, think of the writer as, or an artist as a radio that is always on. most of the time it's static, it's not intelligible, but then suddenly, when you sometimes, there's no expectation of when it will occur. There's nothing but clarity coming through. And I felt like that was kind of close to, like I would write a lot, and but I would recognize that either I was trying to invent that feeling of something coming through me, or it just wasn't happening. And it wasn't that, some of those worked out okay, but I felt very lucky to often have this other experience where, if anything, I might have the first line, but as soon as I was in the midst of writing the first line, the second line was already being created. And but again, I think different processes often. I remember hearing about an interview with Tom Waits where he was in an automobile in a traffic jam in New Jersey, and what surprised me was he didn't have any taping device in the car, and something came to him, and he couldn't do anything with it, so he started talking. He didn't even call it a muse or inspiration. He just said, "Please come back tomorrow. I work on these things every day. Come back when I'm in the studio." And it made perfect sense to me. I was just surprised that there was no taping device, because it only happened about a decade ago. And the other thing was funny with songs was, but then I talked to writers about this on people who traveled, especially maybe on trains or in cars if you weren't driving. On trains, I would have a lot of inspiration. And when I've compared notes with people about that, it seemed like we all felt in some very generic way. It had something to do with motion, just that we were in motion and looking around. And they weren't long trips, but when I would train to New York, that would often happen. Something would come to me. Hi. I'm sorry.
You said that you had 3.5 years between your first two moments of clarity. And so, did that increase in frequency after those first two times? And do you still?
A little bit. I've actually been missing that experience as far as I can tell the last few years. Although once in a while, I say to myself one of two things. I say, well, maybe it's happening, but in a way that I just don't recognize yet. And when I look at the work later, I'll have some sense that, oh, now I see what was going on. Or that a couple times I've said, well, if it isn't happening anymore, it's another reason to give my permission to myself to just write anything. But I miss it. It does happen with songs. I wouldn't describe how I draw as that at all. I don't draw with a great deal of intention, but I don't think I ever really feel that something while I'm doing it is working through me. But I probably, on a daily basis, I probably, just in a regular routine way, probably spend a little more time drawing than anything. But it might be also because it seems very relaxing. And one time when I intentionally was using my left hand because I was writing it, I really felt like I could feel relaxing chemicals going down my back. It was really pleasant. But it wasn't something that would happen like all the time, but maybe monthly for a few years, and then 6 months later. And once in a while I'll look back at something that is old, and suddenly I'll realize the piece of writing seems very alive, but it always bored me before. I don't know exactly why that happens, but again, I don't think it's that uncommon an experience. I'm going to be returning to the planet Earth in about 2 months. When do you take it out? Hi.
Boring, simple question, but the black flower, can you make some comment or explain?
When I was reading a poem tonight and looked at it briefly beforehand, but especially when I was reading it, I had kind of forgotten that it made its occurrence as frequently as it did. And it was, as I was reading, I thought, gee, I'd like to think about this a little bit, because I don't recall exactly why. It was from my imagination or something that happened in the poem. It wasn't based on the fact of a black flower, wasn't something I knew, but but I'm glad you asked that, because I'll make sure I'll just think about that a bit and see. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.